Good morning. It's time for Courageous Woman again. Um, our story today is going to be about Rose Daniels. I got all of my information from the journal that was written in let me look at the dates. In 1995, it was in the summer edition. This book has been out of print, so it's no longer available. But Rose Daniels has a really interesting story that I think that you will find compelling today as we go throughout her story. The article was written by Doris Karen Burton. She also wrote a book called Blue Mountain Folks, and she took some of the information from her book and put it in this article. The name of her article was Navajo Slave Girl Marries Mormon Polygamist. And there are many passages in here that are from Rose in her own voice. And so today I'm going to be mostly telling her story through her own words. That is really a privilege to have entry of an interview that she gave that has been translated or transcribed and available for us to read. And so I'm going to be reading a lot today, so I'm going to flip the camera so that you can see her picture. There you go, that's Rose. It says here, when a little Navajo girl, Rose, drove her family's tiny sheep herd into the hills, little did she know that she would be taken captive by Ute Indians and 4 days later would be living her life in the Colorado-Utah area. She would never have dreamed she would grow up to marry a Mormon polygamist, settle on a beautiful ranch east of the Dinosaur National Monument quarry on the Green River, the ranch first inhabited by first people would again have a native occupant, this time the beautiful Rose. I'm going to go ahead and skip right to her words. I am not an Indian. I am a Navajo. I do not know how old I am, but I know I am past 90, and I can still ride a horse with the best of them. Grandpa Daniels always called me a little bit of a chick. I would like to go back someday to the place where I was captured. I can see it so plainly. I would recognize it. There was a big gulch that came out of the mountains and a little prong from the east that joined the gulch. I know it pointed to the east because the sun came out of the head of that little prong every morning. My father and mother and another family camped where the little prong joined the main gulch. Down the big gulch, just a little way where it went out of the mountains, my grandmother and grandfather had a little farm. They raised corn and beans and melons. We camped above so we could graze the sheep. There were no white men in the country or no other Navajo that I know about. I was only a little girl, I think about 7. We lived in an open country with cedars on the top of rock gulches. One morning, my father went up on the bluff above the camp to get a dead cedar for firewood. He would throw the wood over the bluff into camp. I and another little girl my age that belonged to the other family started off with the sheep. We got to the bend of the canyon where we were out of sight of my mother's camp and not quite in sight of my grandmother's when we heard a funny noise. It was a lot of yipping yipping just like a flock of wild geese. I often think about that. How it sounded like a flock of wild geese. We should have run and hid, but we just stood there. We did not know what it was. In a minute, we saw 12 Indians coming with their horses on a big run. The Indians didn't have on no clothes, just moccasins and breech cloth. Their bodies were painted yellow and black. They were swinging war clubs. They just stood there, and we just stood there and looked at them. They had strings around their heads to keep their hair back. They stopped in a circle around us, tied us up, and rode away, yipping like wild geese. The sun was on one hand high in the east when they rode away, and it was on one hand high in the west when they came back. They had another Navajo girl and 2 little boys with them, and lots of blankets, horses, sheep, and scalps. They put me and the other little girl on a horse, but they kept us tied. We went down past grandmother's farm and saw her and grandfather lying there with arrows sticking out of them. It must have been in the fall of the year, because grandfather was lying in the watermelon patch, and the watermelons was right. Them Indians took us up on the hill east of grandmother's farm and built a fire in the cedars. Then they killed some of our sheep, just enough for supper, and threw big hunks of meat on the coals. They ate some of this, ashes and all, like they were hungry. Then we started off in the night. We traveled north 4 nights and 4 days. At night we didn't travel as fast as we did in daytime, but we kept going. Sometimes, when the grass was good, we would stop for a little while to let the sheep and horses eat. The Indians would cook some meat and rest, but they never made camp or went to sleep. We traveled out of the low country up into high country and then back into low country again. We crossed 2 big rivers. I remember that the water came to my armpits. The Indians crowded the sheep into the water, but they kept swimming back to the same side, so they let them go. Finally, we came to the Ute camp. I think it was on the White River, but I don't know for sure. I know that they were White River Utes. When the squaws saw us coming, they started to wail and cry. I guess they thought some of their braves were dead. When they found out that none of them were dead, they were happy and got ready for a big dance. I remember that dance. The men took colored dirt and mixed it with grease and rubbed their bodies. The women put scalps on the end of sticks. There was drums and some singing. The squaws all stood in a line and danced back and forth, waving the scalps in the air. The men jumped around in a bunch at one side, waving their clubs. War clubs ain't just the right name. They were like slingshots with a loop around their wrists, and the shot was a big rock or something that they never threw. They used it to hit people as they rode past them. I never liked these Indians. They was always moving. They would have a dance and move, and then they would have another dance. Pretty soon they would dance a dance and move again. They didn't have nothing to eat but meat, and they cooked it on coals or something that they would build a rack of sticks and broil it that way. They did not have no pots, no kettles, or anything. The White River Utes didn't have beads in them days. Their teepees were of buffalo skin with the hair scraped off. If they wore any clothes at all, it was buckskin. Their summer moccasins were made of buckskin, and in winter they made moccasins out of buffalo hide with wool on the inside. I hated the White Rivers and ran away every chance I got. I wasn't afraid to be out all night among the wolves and the bears. I'm not afraid now either. There was no place to run except out in the hills, and they always found me and brought me back. but I made them so much trouble that they sold me to Tabby. He was the chief of the Uintas. We still moved around and danced just the same as before. The first white men I ever saw were trappers who came to Tabby's camp. They had long hair down their backs and beards. They dressed in buckskin and fur caps in the winter. In summer, they wore caps the squaws made for them out of willows. Sometimes they wore a handkerchief around their heads in summer, like Indians do now. I remember 2 of them came to camp and stayed at Tabby's teepee. They had a council. I, just a little girl, and their names meant nothing to me. Since then, I have wondered who they were. I have heard Kit Carson was in the country, and I wonder if I ever saw him. The Ute was always afraid of the Sioux. I remember how they used to talk about the Sioux. They went into Sioux country after buffalo sometimes, but they kept a sharp lookout. Life was better with Tabby than with the White Rivers. We still ate mostly meat, but once we moved west of the mountains to the Mormon settlements, we got wheat, not corn, wheat. The Indians were crazy about that wheat. The squaws used to put it in their open-top baskets with live coals, and then they would shake the baskets so that the coals would not burn the willow. They would shake the baskets until the wheat popped. Then they would eat it. After that first taste, they would give the Mormons anything for wheat. They used to beg for it. I used to run away from the Uintas, same as I did the White Rivers. I guess that is why Tabby sold me. 2 of us girls was sold at Fort Bridger that time. The other was Red Jacket Jane. Both her mother and father had died, so the Indians sold her. She used to run away from the whites at Fort Bridger. The Indians would get paid for bringing her back. They would get a sack of flour for returning her. Finally, the whites got tired of it and told the Indians they could keep her. After that, the Uintas sold her to the White Rivers. Fort Bridger is where she learned to talk English and how to act in a house. When Meeker was made agent at White River, his wife hired her to help in the kitchen. When Meeker got to quarreling with the Indians, she overheard the family say that the soldiers were coming to kill the Utes because they hadn't done what Meeker wanted. That made them mad and caused all the trouble. When I was sold to the white people, I never did run away to the Indians, not me. Tabby sold me at Fort Bridger to a rebel soldier named Bynum Lane. Bynum was a tie cutter. Then he got cattle. As soon as he got cattle, he got to drinking, and his wife quit him. She took her kids, went to her mother's ranch in Weber Canyon. Grandpa Daniels was her father. He was a Mormon. His other wife lived in Wanship, Utah, and I was sent there. That is where I first met Grandpa Daniels, and he called me a little bit of a chick. Grandpa Daniels found some coal in the mountains, which he was riding for cattle, and started to dig it. Brigham Young heard about it and sent him a threatening letter. He said Grandpa Daniels was desecrating church property. I was afraid that they would send over a destroying angel. Grandpa Daniels split from the church after that. I remember how he used to laugh and say, "I don't put much stock in a God that won't let man dig a hole in the ground." Both his wives quit him on account of this. The church won, and Grandpa Daniels moved down to where Heber City is now and took up a place at the mouth of Daniels Canyon. He toughed it out there for 2 years, fighting what he called the Grasshopper War. And then he gave up and went to Tintic, Utah, and worked in the mines. That was in 1871. We stayed there 3 years. Then he wrote to one of his sons in Nevada to come join him. We all moved to a ranch at Provo. It had changed a lot since I was there with the Uintas. Grandpa Daniels left us there while he went to hunt gold in the Black Hills, but he didn't find any. He stayed in Provo until Brigham Young died in 1877. Grandpa Daniels had a lot of growing boys. He wanted to leave them all a start. So when Ashley Valley opened for the settlement in 1882, he said, "Let's leave this ranch for Dave and go to Ashley and build up a place for Jean and Ben." So we moved over there, and by the time Jean was big enough to take over the Ashley ranch, Grandpa Daniels had spotted a likely location for a new ranch east of Green River on Cub Creek. He had used up his rights by now, so he took a squatter's claim in the desert under Blue Mountain. Our cattle summered on the mountain in Colorado. The first snowstorm would bring them down Cub Creek to winter range. Grandpa Daniels used to say, "It's only a step from summer to winter range." She goes on to talk about how it was that when they lived there, and they were actually married at the time. She was very young. He told her to go back and marry a good man, and she said she would never marry an Indian and no white man would have her. And she was older in her life when she did marry Aaron, and she called him Grandpa. They were to have 4 children together. I'm going to put a picture of him up here so you can see what he looked like. They had 4 children together, and as you can see, she said that they kind of started ranches for his children from his previous marriages. Then they went on to have 4 children. There was Hal Albert, and then there was Walter Daniels, and then they had a daughter. I forgot to write down her name, and then there was another daughter, Matora Daniels. They were a lovely family, and after they'd lived out there at Cub Creek for a while, they decided to move. The reservation had been started, and they wanted to put all of the Native Americans onto a reservation. And her husband, Aaron, decided she might as well go there and take up what was hers. And so they did. They went over to the White Rocks area and started living in that area. There was more about her story, but one of the things I found is that she got 160 acres on the reservation. She had an education when she was with Aaron's first and second wife, so she did know some English. And she said it was a never-ending hard life trying to establish a home on a barren reservation. She was at home at last, and she set to work to make the land productive so she could survive the blasting winds, the drifting sand, the grasshoppers, and the drought. Aaron taught her the art of gardening and food preservation and helped her with the planting. Because the area was so dry, she managed to invent her own method of irrigation by making little furrows among the plants and guiding the water down to them from the Uinta and White Rivers. Soon there on the reservation, others on the reservation wanted to have food like Rose Daniels raised and saved for winter eating. So with Rose to help and guide them, they too planted and were not hungry. In 1896, 8 years after they went to the reservation, Aaron died, leaving Rose to care for the children and keep the ranch producing. He was buried on the ranch in a plot of ground east of the house. Year after year, Rose planted her seeds. She raised cabbage, onions, carrots, turnips, tomatoes, peas, cucumbers, melons, beans, and squash. Each year she cared for her plants, and then at harvest time she set aside the best seeds to be used at planting time the next year. She saved the seeds in little glass jars or in paper bags or cans. As the years went by, she cared for her home and her children and made sure they had schooling until they were all married and had families of their own. She was able to live alone on the ranch in the home she had helped Aaron build. Since the old road ran through their property, she was kind to people traveling through the reservation. She often fed them, gave them shelter for the night, and cared for their horses. She loved horses and would ride over the reservation, taking care of the sick with her own medicine, a combination of Indian and pioneer remedies. Since she could speak both the Indian and English languages, Rose was invaluable as an interpreter. Everyone loved this brown, small Indian woman with the sparkling eyes, known as Grandma Daniels. She was a familiar sight on her old gray horse. When Rose was about 90 years old, A.C. Hildreth of the Horticultural Field Station in Cheyenne, Wyoming, accompanied by an Indian service agent, visited her. He was shown her garden and the seeds she had saved in the little seed house and had been built near her home. Among these seeds, he found 3 beans that were different from the others, and he asked if he could take them. With her consent, he wrapped them carefully and took them back to the experiment station in Cheyenne, where they were subsequently planted. From these 3 beans came a newly developed lima bean that was soon placed on the market. It is the only known lima bean which can be successfully grown in the short dry seasons of Utah, Wyoming, and South Dakota. Grandma Daniels may very well be the only Indian who has given to the world a kind of Luther Burbank contribution. Rose lived alone in her little home, which was filled with articles of handiwork and every special beadwork for which she was well known. She took care of her horse and her children and, of course, her plants. She died of cancer in July 4th of 1943. She was 103 years old. This wonderful woman, during her full life, was busy doing good for her fellow men and was loved wherever she went. She was the mother of 4, 25 grandchildren, and many great-grandchildren. The gold mine that they said that Aaron may have known where it was never found. He never revealed the location. He gave Rose a map, though, on his deathbed, and telling her what the benefits could be for her family. But Rose, with her gentle wisdom, destroyed those maps because she was fearful that the gold would bring problems to her family. I'd like to show you one last picture of Rose in her elderly age. Courageous she was, remarkable she was. And it sounds like she blessed the people of the Uinta Basin in every way that she could. I hope you enjoyed her story today. I wish I could say that the articles are still available for you to purchase. Unfortunately, they are not. But the Blue Mountain Folks book is available in our museum. See you next week.